talk that you gave once, you talked about how like someone said like the language comes from like mother's milk or like breast milk. There's some ideology about like that's like super misogynist. Maybe you can explain that. I was like fast. I was like, wait, what? Like we trace this back to like your mother? Like that's crazy. But I think it's all about this ideology of like purity of language and purity of science, and we need to like distill the natural. So how do you approach that? Like what's going on there with purity?
Oh my God. Okay, yes. I mean, I obviously could give a talk about that because I did, but I
Yeah.
will just I will say a little, okay. And it's so funny because I was like writing all of that stuff while I was breastfeeding. And so like the first round of that paper was like breastfeeding my first kid. And then the second round we're like doing revisions. It was my second kid. And I was like, this is too ooky. Okay. And this is also why, we need to read beyond. I mean, I don't know, again, like reading sort of widely helps us understand where these ideologies come from. And, this is amazing work done by scholars like so Stephanie Hackert has written a book about native speaker, and then there's also work like mother tongues and nations. There's work on like nationalism, European nationalism, and
Right.
where this idea like nativeness idea got so
Well, even now with like the modern nation state, the whole idea is like purity and linguistic boundaries, and we need to have, and then that's how you get to like linguicide coinciding with ethnocide, blah blah. But like, for
right.
real, like this is a thing. Like like even in America, you come to America, you learn English, right? Like,
Yes, yes. I mean, these
yeah,
ideologies are really, and it's also helpful to see like, okay, right, like how people across contexts and times think about the relationship between language and identity and in an essentialist way or not sometimes,
hmm
right? Or like what is like, yeah, it's not, we haven't always, and we don't all have these same ideologies about what it means to be a native speaker of a language or what nativeness is and where it comes from and what are the conditions that are required for that. And those ideas are really tied up in, yeah, lots of different things. So I guess like to go back to your like, so if we're not talking about this idea of like the motherhood thing, right? So at least the story that we tell, this is the partial story. Okay, the story that we tell in this article about it is like it goes back to Dante. And so he like, and that was like one of the first like things I read like freshman year of college in a linguistics class was, Dante talking about advocating for Italian, right, as opposed to Latin. Okay. So advocating for the vernacular. And the way that he defined uh, these, like, I guess I'll say languages, but the way that he defined these modes of using
yes,
language, um, were like, oh, one is the language learned at the nurse's breast, versus the other is the one that's taught in school. Okay. And so that is sort of this division. But actually, if you go back even further, there's this idea of breast milk as like a transmission, like
yeah,
metaphor. So it goes like back to like sort of liturgy, right? And at this time, if we're thinking about Europe, like different parts of this part of Europe anyway, and how like scholarship and, sort of religious contexts were very intertwined, right? So these are sort of like liturgy and like, yeah, these are not like sort of separated ideas. So people talked a lot about how like, so the Virgin Mary, like breastfeeding Jesus. This is like a big like the lactating Mary is like a very like important image. And so there's all these like different interesting like images and like there's like a saint that got like sainted with like anyway, there's a lot of interesting images with that. And the idea there was that Mary transmitted like humanity to Jesus through her breast milk. And so that's how he got this like other like human more human like the human qualities. Okay. And I'm speaking as this as an outsider. I'm not Christian. I
right.
was not raised this way. So like this is from my reading. So I might like be saying things in a not accurate way and I apologize. Or like in a I'm speaking as an outsider, non-expert. But who has done reading on these different things. So the idea there was like, all right, there's this idea of transmission of culture and also then language through breast milk.
Right.
Okay. And so Dante, like when we're going like the Dante time, right? Like, so the way that like he was like who he was talking to was like, first of all, like is a certain class of people that have like wet nurses, right? So
Hmm.
it's not like he's not talking about like a mom actually passing down language to a baby. It's like literally the idea of like a wet nurse, like nursing. So it's not like a biological inheritance in that way. It's like materially like through like milk. Okay. So then so that idea like sort of persists, and then we sort, then if we're thinking about like how this sort of genetic essentialism thing comes in, then we get into, eugenics and, like we got, yeah, anyway, we have Galton, we have all these eugenicists, we have folks and the colonial project, racialization, hierarchies, right? So all these folks like were, and this is when we think about the beginnings of linguistics and anthropology and all these disciplines, they were really clearly in service of both like empire, in this right Western frame, the how the institutional support came for these scholars doing this type of work was empire, and also like it was also um missionary, like so it was also a conversion, right? So these
Right.
are really like this is where like the money is coming from, this is where the training is coming from, this idea is coming from. So that's also why we have to like understand those concepts before we think about, well, where do these ideas come from, right? It isn't that those contexts are really important. So what were people trying to do and understand? So their taxonomy and so typology, which is the field, like a field that I am that I work in, that like the idea of creating types of
Yep.
languages is connected to creating types of people. And
Yep.
people were doing that, of course, right when this is happening, right? There's also people like arguing with each other, like, no, that's not how it works, right? So there was always pushback, right? And
Right.
that's also another thing that I think is important. Like when we think about rejecting these inherited frames, like we can also think about that as learning from and uplifting people who have been arguing against us this whole time. That
Yep.
includes folks that are in were in like writing scholarship and in these privileged positions, but also the people who knew from the very start who were being studied and were like, fuck you, like
Yeah.
don't, that's not how my language works.
Yeah.
And you are just trying to convert me. So I'm gonna, give you like, yeah, I'm not gonna speak to you in the way that I would do or whatever, right? So people like, I think giving everybody agency as much as possible is important in this situation, including like the ideas that are so problematic that we're always pushed back against. But of course, it's expeditious for, you know, folks that are trying to extract resources and create power imbalances, and it's expeditious for that to be the hegemonic narrative, right? But
Yeah.
you know that there's always counter narratives. Yeah, so it's you can't talk about the history of these different things without talking about this is like the intellectual ecology and when this is happening, right? And
Yeah.
then if we're thinking about nations, there's a lot of people have written about, sort of one nation, one language, and these ideas that really got taken up. This is something that like I find, it's sort of important in the history of linguistics, but it's also like relevant to my own personal like background because there's this idea of like, oh yeah, the Indo-Aryan languages or Indo-European, right? And so people were like obsessed with Sanskrit and all of these things. And I come from a family background where like my family is caste privileged. Like we're Brahmins. Like my grandpa, like, recited the Vedas or whatever, and like grew up learning Sanskrit and was like a priest and stuff. And so there's a lot of like oppression in the history of my family, but also like these are the people that the Nazis were literally valorizing, like, like Aryans, right? And so it's important to push back against that also, this idea of this like pure, like Vedic Sanskrit that was like handed down generations is like very fetishized, like, and was very fetishized by people who are like interested in racial hierarchies, sort of in the 1800s and to this day, right? There's actually a lady who was, God, I really went down a rabbit hole when I was looking up some stuff about this like a while ago. I was writing about,
Yeah.
nation statehood and eugenics and linguistics and essentialism and racial essentialism, all these things. And then I came across this Nazi who changed her name to Savitri, my name,
Wow.
because and she like went down to India to like try to like, and she said, just to be like an envoy for Nazis in India. And I was like, so this is and so this is
Wow.
personal for me because it's something that we need to push against. And also it's pernicious because it feels really intuitive to people like, oh yeah, like different people look different, so they must be different in this sort of essential way. And it's just not how any of this works. It's not how genetics works, it's not how biology works, it's not how society works. It's just not how any of this works. It's false. And there's a lot of the challenges with how people think about, for example, incorrectly think about how language learning works
Yeah.
is also based on this, right? This idea that like, oh, we have this critical period. Wait, is it one? Is it five? Is it 18 now? Like, people keep moving it around. Like, okay. But a lot of those ideas are based on these very essentialist ideas of how language could works, and
Right.
also false ideas about how learning works, and false ideas about how brain development and biology work too. And so you just
Yeah.
and it's dangerous. Like it's dangerous to have those false ideas. So on one hand, right, if I'm thinking about, okay, my word order work or whatever, it's like it's interesting and I want to like better describe how word order works and how it changes and what's going on with that. But then the more you dig into where some of these assumptions come from, the more you see actually these are not only pervasive assumptions, but they are the backbone of the fascist project
Right.
right now. And people can sit in their little offices and say, well, maybe it makes sense to think about race as race as biological and just like pretend like that's an innocent thing to say. That's just a
Right.
thought experiment. And it's just like, no, that's boring, first of all, because people have been saying that for like 600 years. We already knew it was wrong. But also,
Yeah.
it's just wrong. Like, and so no, like we're not doing this. And so when we see those similar types of bad assumptions being played out in how we think about language, it's just like there's no excuse. We've already done this. This is boring. Like we need to move on.
Thank you. No, I think what I would say just to like tie that is like you're pointing to the fact that essentialism and racism and racialized ideology and all these things, it's all connected, right?
Yeah.
Like these ideologies about purity in the field and purity of language and like if language is mathematical and positivist, then that's more pure than if language is messy and like a site of discrimination, whatever. Okay. But then also that the solution and the refute of those ideas, they're also complicated and multifaceted and interconnected. And you're getting things wrong about acquisition, but also about neurobiology, but also about social norms and like the milieu in which someone is raised. Right. Like this is all connected. So it takes a real multifaceted approach to kind of combat these different things.